Hello, I think Victoria starts.
Hello everyone, so I'm Victoria and this is Armen. First of all, a huge thank you to the Arch Plus team for pulling off this absolutely amazing program. It was a Herculean task for such a small but superly kind of well-coordinated team. Thank you so much to Joanne, who has been our key point of contact throughout this whole time. And of course, huge thank you to the contributors who were very happy to come on board for this project and to enter into a conversation which was not really sort of directed and teleological, but was somewhat more speculative, and hopefully will have some interesting results to kind of to all be happy about at the end of these 4 days. So when we were initially invited to co-produce a program that engages with Bauhaus from the perspective of contemporary positions and conversations in progress, we thought that there isn't really much that we can add from, let's say, a purely scholarly point of view, since neither of us are really scholars on Bauhaus. But nonetheless, we were very excited to take up a topic as multifaceted and rich as Bauhaus, and one that has a plethora of established sets of discourses attached to it. But instead of focusing on its much discussed outward manifestations, or perhaps critiquing the evidently controversial aspects of its kind of historical makeup, we wanted to divert the attention to some of the underlying logics that Bauhaus tapped into from the perspective of today's financialized information societies. Therefore, our approach to planning our part of the program was somewhat speculative and predicated on testing a hypothesis, and also predicated, let's say, on a future-oriented approach. So rather than just kind of thinking about a revisionist project, we thought, what would kind of the Bauhaus as a set of concepts, how could it be useful to understanding something about the future? So the hypothesis that we were interested in testing was, if Bauhaus were to emerge in today's conditions, its larger project, we argue, would no longer be to influence social processes through production of objects for mass use, but instead through the design of protocols that direct and mediate our physical digital infrastructures.
Of course, over the course of the last half a century, the very notion of progress that Bauhaus as a modernist universal project was aligned with has been substantially and justifiably discredited through countless immensely important critiques. And yet, there still remains something highly appealing and perhaps even persuasive or necessary about Bauhaus' insistence on art and design and cultural production at large, finding modi operandi for working through the emerging structuring dynamics of its time and becoming an active, if at times politically volatile, a constituent of their articulation. Thus, the question that we wanted to explore through the work of our contributors was, what would be the spirit of Bauhaus today were it to emerge in 2018? And here again, our initial point of departure more than a year ago was a switch in logics from object production, object design and craft to design of protocols and infrastructures. There are 4 interrelated directions that we set out to explore through this overarching agenda. As a starting point, Victoria already mentioned it, what would we need to understand about nature of today's infrastructures in order to be able to infiltrate the logic and operations? This is a question that dovetails with the key concern voiced in the Datatopia project, we think, serving as a really productive intersection between the 2 strands or various strands of this week's program. Secondly, so first one is the infrastructure. Secondly, if you want to shift away from from some of the modernist associations with progress as manifested through Bauhaus, but at the same time we contextualize and develop some of its operational vectors, what new models of progress could be proposed. Perhaps instead of thinking the problem of progress head-on, it is more useful to focus on the questions of organizational forms that would be required to impact existing institutional ecologies. And finally, what lessons can be learned about the history of Bauhaus that opens up new readings of its legacy as dictated by the concerns of the future. We'll briefly explain in the following each inquiry, each of the 4 directions, and for the sake of clarity, mention one of the contributors each for each direction that we invited. Although this is, of course, a somewhat reductive way of mentioning their practices, as all of them have important things to say about all of the 4 dimensions. Most contributors are also practitioners. That's important to be mentioned, and the practical dimension is something that is key not just to Bauhaus, But within our limited possibilities here during these 4 days, also in organizing the workshops as a kind of micro-testing site for the more theoretical propositions that we witness.
Yeah, so as has been already mentioned, there's a sort of two parts for the program for the following 4 days. There's the kind of more internal part of the program, which are the workshops, and then the more external part of the program, which which are the talks. And the way that we thought about kind of combining these two dimensions with Armen was to pair up practitioners who have, let's say, a more theoretical contribution with practitioners who are, let's say, much more straightforward practitioners, and have them devise workshops that would be testing out some of the key proposals that are going to be sort of disseminated, circulated through the public program. So the first inquiry direction that Armen has already mentioned concerns the significance of infrastructures in understanding the role that artistic, design, and architectural practices can play in governance. So to this extent, the invitation to Keller Easterling is somewhat obvious. She's a thinker who in the recent years has made very important connections between spatial design and its latent potential as a vehicle of extra-state governance. So in her 2014 book, Extra Statecraft, Easterling argues that in order to tap into this potential, architectural and design thinking needs to shift away from identification with the production of object forms and instead understand its role in the construction of spatial relations as active forms, or informational dispositions that are produced in the enmeshment between human design and architectural software, and that achieve unprecedented scale through dissemination across diverse geographical locations via globalized architectural practices. So the workshop that will be launched tomorrow as a collaboration between Keller and the Alliance of Southern Triangle, an art collective, will be very much dedicated to this sort of larger question. AST, the Alliance of Southern Triangle, the art collective, they explore the possibilities of such extra-state governments through cultural production by deploying artistic and architectural tools in reshaping the image of Miami as a template for thinking beyond the doomsday scenarios of climate change and sea level rise. We initially worked with one of the members of AST last year during a 4-month fellowship that Armen and I curated in Miami. It was called the Recalibrated Institution. And the concerns of that program very much resonate with many aspects of this program, although approached from a very different angle from the angle of the cultural institution. And particularly the question of medium design that was inspired by Keller's more recent work and that will be explored by AST during the workshops in the next couple of days.
The second question is very much about finding an approach to the notion of progress, as I mentioned before, that does not fall into the trap of universalism, but where we either don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, as in today's climate, it feels necessary, we think, to reconnect to the promise of progress. Once again, what we still find interesting in the Bauhaus conception of progress is the pragmatism of not shying away from engaging with large-scale dynamics. Today, this might mean having a good grasp on how geopolitical and technological developments are intertwined, something that another contributor, Benjamin Breton, has focused on in his practice and in a book, The Stack on Software and Sovereignty, that has by now become the go-to reference for understanding the interplay between planetary computational infrastructures and governance. Thus, it's impossible to disentangle geopolitics from technological developments and the effects on organization of societies. Ben's work forces us to see from the future, understanding that planning and policy making can happen in radically different ways to which we have accustomed to. In all instances, organization is pivotal. Why do you use words that I don't know how to pronounce? Another thing that may need to be articulated in the issue of scale and the difference between the still human scaled approach of the Bauhaus and the evident departure from that in the current moment as we move forwards. For the last 2 years, Ben has been running a program called The New Normal, as most of you know, at the Strelka Institute in Moscow. Here he will run a series of workshops together with Nikola Boyadiev, who's here. He's the education program design tutor. It sounds so technical. Basically, everything would fall apart without him. He's let's say 22/7. He's there, running everything. It's 22. That's realistic of the program, and some also of the alumni of Striker will be running these workshops together with Ben.
Right, so we're almost done. The third strand concerning our hypothesis brings together the infrastructural question, the first strand, the second strand, which is the one on progress, and lands it in the realm of new organizational forms that may not be revolutionary, but the hybridity of which functions as a potential pivot for entire institutional ecologies. So one such project is forensic architecture, founded and directed by L. Weitzman, who will be one of the speakers the day of tomorrow. Yeah. So FA, Forensic Architecture, is a transdisciplinary research agency that blends the practices of architecture, art, investigative journalism, law, forensics, and deploys innovative and technological tools in constructing forensic evidence that is presented in legal and political contexts where human rights violations and war crimes are concerned. So FA's deployment of synthesized knowledge made possible through the development of digital technology, whether it's proprietary architectural software, open source software, or social media, but also good old architectural toolkit relating to spatial analysis, is an excellent example of the aforementioned active form, which we would identify as a key prescription if Bauhaus was resituated to deal with the reality of the 21st century.
The final point concerns the question that what we can learn or relearn or unlearn from and about the history of Bauhaus that opens up new readings of it, of the Bauhaus, as well as with regards of our future, of our data topic future. Here it is, we think, the work of Ty Smith that somehow takes up all of the aforementioned topics and does so with regards to the historical Bauhaus. At the same time, her investigation is by no means only a historical one. On the contrary, her research, especially the book Weaving Theory, shows the relevance also in the context of creating of Datatopia, in exploring a joint genealogy of textile and computation, or two different textile logics, the network and the computation. The woven textile having a computational logic in the sense that it's binary and algorithmics. These are topics, by the way, that she also discusses in a very interesting interview. It is in one of the readers somewhere with Ida Solar, who's also here. I haven't seen her yet. And both of them will do a workshop tomorrow. So finally, the topic of weaving also touches on the question of institution and the notion of progress, or simple notions of progress, especially with the not just historic gendering of weaving as a female practice. And again, if we speak about institutions here, they must be understood as carriers of larger structural logics, so to come to an end. We hope, or we're pretty sure, that with the amazing guests that we have here, and we were really surprised that all of them came. No, we had the first meeting that, oh, this would be great, you know, and then we sent out some emails and all said yes. Initially, we wanted to invite 3, and then all the 4 said yes. So I better stop here. I hope you remember we're too long, I guess, but like we try to make it somewhat didactic, and that you remember the 4 directions. First is the emphasis on infrastructure. Secondly, the progress or the problematization of the notion of progress. Then the question of institution and organization is the third, and then finally the last one, the fourth, to revisit the notion of craft. Let me also say thanks. It would take another half an hour to say thanks to everyone. I just had at least one email here during the preparation. But so I just say thanks to Arc Plus, because over the last couple of months or years, but also in the future, it really has become more than just an architecture journal. I'm not an architecture theorist or so, but I think it's one of the rare intellectual hubs or political hubs or ideological, in the positive sense, hubs that we really desperately need in times of this. So it's yeah. So I'm really grateful that they gave us the possibility to invite people that actually said they're coming, not because of us, but because of all this here. So thanks a lot.